Good morning, my name is Josh from CyclonesOZ, and here is your detailed forecast update on Tropical Cyclone Alfred, still a Category 2 strength tropical cyclone well offshore from the Queensland coastline, where a landfall is expected in about 72 hours' time. Tropical Cyclone Alfred remains a strong system, and it is expected to go in and lash the southeastern Queensland coastline. So in this forecast update, I'm going to be telling you what impacts are expected and how to prepare for this tropical cyclone, because it is certainly going to be a strong one. All of that plus more coming up in today's weather forecast. If you are brand new to the channel, please consider subscribing and also leave a like on the video while you're at it. The support lately has been much appreciated. But let's get stuck straight into things with a look at Tropical Cyclone Alfred. Right now you can see it's a very sad looking and quite an ugly system, to be frank. I mean, it's really lost all of its thunderstorms and convection right now. It is offshore from Brisbane, about 400 kilometres or so offshore from Brisbane here, and because it is a southern dominated system, the winds along the Queensland coastline are not that strong at all, but you can see wind observations still pretty strong here and there. I mean, we're still looking at wind observations up at Double Island Point into the high 40 kilometre an hour with gusts up to about 60 kilometres an hour, so it's near gale force there, with certainly close to gale force wind gusts. Some heavy showers still streaming around the Queensland coastline as well, with some very heavy force streaming into the coastline around the northeastern corner of New South Wales, so Yamba and Lismore getting a couple of heavy showers through there throughout the course of this morning. Lord Howe Island has also getting some pretty strong winds here, gusts up to about 63 kilometres an hour, so gale force wind gusts there. Now, normally when you'd look at Tropical Cyclone Alfred and it looking like this, you'd be thinking, oh, this is an extra tropical low, this tropical cyclone is completely dead, and I'll forgive you for thinking that this tropical cyclone is completely dead, and I actually thought that as well when I looked at the satellite imagery, but the temperature observations suggest that this is still a warm core tropical cyclone, which means it isn't subtropical or an east coast low or anything like that, even though it's very much behaving like one. You can see temperature observations down here, 25, 26 degrees Celsius, and then 30 degrees Celsius up here on a ship's observation. So the temperatures are still quite warm around this tropical cyclone here, which supports that it is still a tropical cyclone and not an extratropical or a subtropical cyclone at this point, which is, I guess, good news for Tropical Cyclone Alfred. It won't struggle to intensify, but definitely some bad news for Brisbane. This tropical cyclone is not done yet. It hasn't headed out to the graveyard like a few people are suspecting. This system still has a lot of fight left in it. Let's jump straight into that forecast right now and see what's expected with Tropical Cyclone Alfred's future. It is a Category 2 strength system at this time here. It's expected to hold that intensity right up towards landfall, maybe even intensify slightly as it gets itself closer to the Queensland coastline. You can see it's actually expected to tighten itself up quite nicely as it gets itself towards landfall. So you can see this is a look at the storm on Thursday morning, but if we pull this right back to where the storm is right now, it's huge. I mean, its area of influence is absolutely colossal, but if we take this storm forward once again out towards Thursday morning, it's a much smaller system as it approaches a coastline. So that means that this system will be wrapping itself up. It'll be becoming a tighter and more defined tropical low, or tropical cyclone, I guess, at that Category 2 status, which means it'll be able to intensify a little bit more freely and a little bit quicker as it gets itself closer to the landfall site. It also means that it will have some more solid impacts around its core as opposed to really messy, broad impacts well away from the storm's core. All in all, it will make it an easier storm to predict, but it will likely bring the storm ashore for Queensland as a slightly stronger tropical cyclone. I'll get to all of the impacts in just a few minutes, but this is just the forecast right now. So you can see from Wednesday night, the tropical cyclone approaching the coast, deteriorating conditions expected to take place from about lunchtime on Wednesday, and things will start to get really nasty along the coastline late Wednesday night into early Thursday morning. Those strong wind gusts up in excess of 100 kilometres an hour should start up by around Thursday mid-morning, and then by around Thursday lunchtime, fully cyclone-blown conditions are expected across much of southeastern Queensland's coastline, between Maroochydore down towards the Gold Coast, with cyclone conditions developing further inland and further north and south of those locations through Thursday night as this tropical cyclone lies up for landfall, which right now is predicted between Brisbane and the Gold Coast by the Eastern Weather Forecast model. I still think that the landfall will happen somewhere between Brisbane and Maroochydore, but again, there's not too much in the way of discrepancies here. Sometime early Friday morning, you can see that tropical cyclone coming ashore as a Category 2 strength system. Peak sustained winds between 90 and 100 kilometres an hour, with those peak wind gusts upon landfall up to 150 kilometres an hour, swinging right in towards the Gold Coast and the northeastern corner of New South Wales. Now, the majority of forecast models still can't exactly agree on whereabouts landfall is expected, and considering the tropical cyclone hasn't done its turn back towards Queensland just yet, it's going to do that later on tonight. So by tomorrow morning, we'll know exactly where this system's expected to make landfall, and there are still discrepancies between forecast models in terms of whereabouts this system is going to make its landfall, but there has been a recent shift in these forecast models calling for this landfall now between Kubeltura down towards the Gold Coast, most likely if we iron this out between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. This is actually a pretty good scenario compared to what we were looking at yesterday, where we were looking at this system making landfall just north of Brisbane, and again, that's because this tropical cyclone will be a tighter and a small system as it gets itself closer to the coastline, which means a lot of these winds are going to be very much dominated on the southern side of this system. It'll definitely be the stronger side of this system, the southern side. So as this system makes landfall, we'll be seeing the strongest winds move ashore into the south side of the system here, which if they're taken out of Brisbane and they head down towards the Gold Coast, it's a much better situation for Brisbane, which has much more population than the Gold Coast. It will still cause nasty damage around the southeastern corner of Queensland, but a direct hit on Brisbane is better than what we were looking at yesterday. So I'll get to the preparations and what you need to be doing, and the same thing with the impacts in just a few moments. Just another aspect of the forecast that I want to be crushing if this system heads further inland is, of course, it's going to weaken very quickly because it's going to be heading over those mountains, which is like walking over a cheese grater for a bit of an analogy. Tropical cyclones do not interact well with mountainous areas. They do not do well over landfall stop, but when it comes to mountains, they get shredded pretty much straight away. So this system will be downgraded to a tropical low just hours after crossing the Queensland coastline, and as it heads further inland out towards Toowoomba, it will feel like just a light breeze, to be honest. That's how quickly this system is expected to cark it, even though it makes landfall early Friday morning, which is kind of set in stone at this point. By late Friday afternoon and into early Friday evening, this system will be remnant energy just over towards Toowoomba and out towards the northwest of Toowoomba. And again, it's time for us to talk about these impacts from this system right now. So when we talk about these wind impacts here, you can see these monster wind gusts can be expected as this system makes its landfall or goes through the process of making landfall here. This is a map called wind accumulation, which is the strongest wind gust in the selected period of time. This is from Wednesday afternoon to late Friday evening. The strongest wind gust does not include sustained winds here, so this is the most damaging winds that we'll be receiving here, and you can think of it as basically the worst case scenario from each forecast model. So taking a look at the wind accumulation here, you can see maximum winds up to 150 kilometers an hour along the coastline from the eastern Bev, and that's pretty much reciprocated between all major forecast models. The GFS is a bit lighter on, considering it is a little bit of a lower resolution forecast model, but between other forecast models, they're pretty much all bang on with 150 kilometer an hour winds, which suggests that there isn't too much uncertainty with how strong this system is going to be when it comes ashore. It's very likely to be at that category 2 status as this system comes ashore here, making that landfall somewhere between Brisbane and the Gold Coast at this time. And sustained winds, like I said, between 90 to 120 kilometers an hour along the coastline, with those gusts up to 150 kilometers an hour. Town by town, place by place, I reckon Brisbane will pick up winds sustained around that 80 to 90 kilometer an hour mark, with peak gusts up to about 125 kilometers an hour. And even though the forecast models are kind of calling for lighter on winds around the Brisbane area, that's just because they're not able to predict accurately what these winds are going to be over land once this system begins interacting with land. But I reckon the strongest wind gusts that Brisbane will receive will be around that 110 to 120 kilometer an hour mark, which could be record breaking for the Brisbane metro area. Locations into the southern suburbs will be picking up wind gusts well in excess of 120 kilometers an hour. Down on the Gold Coast, wind gusts should be up to 140 kilometers an hour, and then in exposed coastal locations such as Burleigh Heads and then down towards Tweed Heads, wind accumulations down there will be well up towards 150 kilometers an hour in more elevated areas. Winds into the mountainous areas and into valleys could be anywhere between 110 out towards 150 kilometers an hour. Certainly some really strong wind gusts expected there, but like I said, once you get further inland and into a little more protected locations, winds will be seldom stronger than 100 kilometers an hour. Still very strong indeed, but not as strong. Considering that the majority of these winds, or the strongest wind gusts, will be coming around from the south as well, for the locations that are exposed to the ocean or exposed to a big plain down towards their south, that's going to bring in the strongest wind gusts to your areas. But if you are protected towards the south or the southeast, you should be escaping the absolute worst of these wind gusts. I'll get to how to prepare for these wind gusts in a later part of this forecast update. Rainfall accumulations, which we've already talked about, but you can see between major forecast models in the landfall process of this tropical cyclone, rainfall accumulations will be around that 200 millimeter mark for the 12 hours in some of the wettest locations, which should be around the Gold Coast hinterland, likely to cause some very significant flash flooding and moderate to major riverine flooding in those areas as well, for the Nerang River and other rivers flowing around the Gold Coast hinterland area. Some significant rainfall is also expected up towards Brisbane, around that 150 millimeter mark in the 12 hours around the landfall process of this tropical cyclone. Rainfall accumulations in the mountains around the Brisbane area should be a little bit lighter though, especially as you head further north. You can see rainfall along the Sunshine Coast has dropped off again as this tropical cyclone shifts further south. Like I said, anywhere further south of where this system makes landfall, minus the immediate course. So where this tropical cyclone makes landfall, anywhere immediately south will be picking up the worst impacts, and still some pretty gnarly impacts expected about 50 kilometers north. But anywhere further north of that, so like I said, anywhere further north of Brisbane, to be honest, it really doesn't look like too much in the way of super significant impacts can be expected from this tropical cyclone. The Gold Coast, however, looks to be the one that's going to get absolutely thrashed in this event here. Out towards Toowoomba, rainfall accumulations up to 150 millimeters possible, and then into the northeast of New South Wales, you can see massive rainfall accumulations are expected as well. And considering the low pressure system will persist for a good couple of days in the wake of this system here, and also funnel ashore quite a bit of rainfall over the next couple of days as well, you can see week-long rainfall accumulations around the northeastern corner corner of New South Wales, approaching 600 millimetres outside of Coffs Harbour here. And this is just on one forecast model, which I tend to find to be a bit of a low baller in terms of how much rainfall gets suggested here every now and then. The axis are calling for rainfall accumulations quite a bit higher than that, and I certainly do reckon that in the northeastern corner of New South Wales, especially up towards Murraybilumba, Tweed Heads, and this sort of area here, Billamby, or Billamble, I believe the name is, and then around the Springbrook National Park and Hinds Dam, the rainfall accumulations there could be approaching 1,000 millimetres in some areas over the course of the week, starting now as Tropical Cyclone Alfred begins its landfall process. So again, for these impacts up here, we're expecting major riverine flooding through the Nerang River, rivers that flowing around the Tweed Heads area and then down towards the Clarence River as well, flowing through Grafton, could be receiving some moderate riverine flooding. And then this river here, the Richmond River rather, some significant flooding is also possible there, between moderate and major flooding alerts there. That drains right out towards the Gold Coast hinterland as well, so some really significant falls can be expected into the Richmond River. The Clarence River, though, may be on the moderate side of things. I don't really expect anything more significant in the way of moderate flooding there. Down towards the Brisbane River, I'm expecting moderate flooding in the Brisbane River, especially upstream. Down towards the Brisbane City area, some minor flooding can be expected, coupled with that storm surge that will be coming through. Still some significant impacts can be expected around the Brisbane River. So if you do live in a really flood-prone area, and I'll get to the impacts and all the details in the impacts just in a little bit. If you live in a really flood-prone area, though, I would definitely have an evacuation plan in place right now, and you'd expect to be preparing for your home right now really thoroughly, because this tropical cyclone, again, not too far away from landfall, and some really significant rainfall accumulations are on the way, which will cause some significant flooding in these areas. Out towards Ipswich as well, some significant flooding can be expected. I expect water levels to get up to about 70 to 75% of what they were back in 2011, the Brisbane floods back in 2011. I reckon the flooding will be really bad, but it's not likely to be record-breaking around the Brisbane area. It's still very much a concern at this point, considering 70 or 75% of what was record-breaking floods in the Brisbane area. That's certainly nothing to be turning a blind eye to right now. So again, I'll be preparing for some significant flooding, and I'll tell you how to do that in just a few moments. The Nerang River, I'm expecting a peak at moderate flooding, and I'm expecting moderate flooding through much of the Gold Coast as well, as this tropical cyclone storm surge causes massive problems through there. And I'll get to that in just a moment. Storm surge will be around that 4 to 5 feet mark across much of the Queensland coastline, slightly higher around the Gold Coast area, with significant wave heights along the coastline up to about 25 feet as well. Significant wave heights offshore have been reported up to about 50 feet, so this tropical cyclone really is a bumpy one and creating some really big seas, that's for sure. Anyways, let's talk preparations right now. For those between Fraser Island, so including Fraser Island down through Rainbow Beach, and then all along the Sunshine and the Gold Coast, including Brisbane and the Gold Coast, and then down towards Grafton, but not including Grafton, and further out inland towards Boonah, Abo Desert, and out towards Toowoomba, but not including Toowoomba, you are under a cyclone watch right now, and I expect that to be upgraded to a cyclone warning later on today. That means that you have a risk of gales between the 24 to 48 hour mark, and it is now time to begin preparations if you haven't already. In fact, it's probably time to begin rushing your preparations towards completion, because this tropical cyclone's landfall is imminent. It's just a couple of days away now, and time has ticked through very, very quickly, that's for sure. So what do you need to prepare? Well, first of all, 5 litres of water per person per day for your household. If there are power cuts and you you lose access to clean water, that is a very, very good thing to have, and an absolute necessity during a tropical cyclone. It's going to be warm, it's going to be humid, it's going to be windy, and it'll also be quite scary as well for a lot of people. So again, making sure you've got plenty of water for these people in your family, especially if you've got vulnerable people in your family, it's a good idea to have extra water on standby. If you are caring for vulnerable people and you live around the Gold Coast area, right along the coastline, or in a very exposed location, then down towards Tweed Heads, and even as far south as Byron Bay, if you live in an exposed location in these areas and you are caring for the elderly or the vulnerable, I recommend, this is my personal recommendation and not official advice, I recommend that you get out of there and get to friends or family's homes out towards Brisbane or Toowoomba. I think it's just too dangerous at this point to be staying there and risking flooding, risking wind damage, risking roof failure. I think there's just a little bit too much risk in these locations now. So that is for exposed coastal locations around the Gold Coast. So that doesn't include the suburbs around the Gold Coast, but if you live along the canals and around Broadbeach, for example, on the Gold Coast, down towards Tweed Heads along the coast, or in an exposed location, even as far south as Byron Bay in an exposed location. And the same deal for Stranbroke Islands, and then up towards Morton Island as well. If you live in these areas and you live in an exposed coastal location or an exposed elevated location, my recommendation right now is to evacuate if it is possible. You much rather, especially if you're caring for the vulnerable or the elderly, to be much safer than to be sorry. Only do so if you have means to get out towards friends or family homes, out towards Toowoomba or further up the Sunshine Coast. You would have to do that today as well. Traffic will be absolutely awful through Wednesday and Thursday as well in the lead up to this tropical cyclone. So getting out of there right now is a very good idea. Getting inland or getting further south or north from this tropical cyclone. That is my personal recommendation right now and not official advice, and that is not to be used as official advice. Make sure you've got your cyclone supplies ready now. For southeastern Queensland, you're not going to have a clue what I'm talking about, considering that this is a very rare tropical cyclone impact. Having canned food and household necessities on standby, of course, not going crazy, because that's panic buying and taking other things away from other families around the shops. And considering that this is a major population centre, even if an absolute worst case scenario happens and some really significant damage is expected and a lot of people end up cut off, access will be restored very quickly around Brisbane. So you only need a couple of days worth of supplies at worst, which means you don't need to buy 30 packs of 4-ply toilet paper. Not only is that going to break the bank, but it's also going to cause a lot of heartache and a lot of hell for other people as well. Improvise where necessary as well. If you live in a flood-prone area along the Brisbane River, the Nerang River, and then into some of the rivers across the northeastern rivers corner of New South Wales, if you live in a flood-prone area through those locations, and you are in the areas where I'm expecting a lot of rainfall to come through, so that includes all of these pink-coloured areas as well, and down towards Lismore, I would recommend preparing your your house for a flooding emergency right now, especially down towards Lismore. They're very flood prone down there, and I reckon the rainfall accumulations in the Lismore catchment will actually be worse than the rainfall that we had over the last flooding event in August of 2024. So I reckon that the floods that Lismore will actually receive from this tropical cyclone will actually be worse than the August 2024 floods. So prepare for some really significant flooding at this time. Some significant flooding also expected upstream in the Nerang River. Once these rivers get down towards the coastline, whilst there still will be some minor to moderate riverine flooding, and those rivers will likely be quite backed up from the storm surge, clogging them up and acting like a dam at their river mouth. The flooding shouldn't be as extreme, and for the most part it looks like a lot of houses have been built high enough these days. They've learnt their lesson from 2011. But if you do live in a flood prone area and you flood on just a regular thunderstorm or a regular downpour, or you're at a risk of flooding on just a regular rainfall event for southeastern Queensland, it is imperative right now that you prepare for flooding, and that is getting your sandbags ready, moving everything up to a second story of the house and evacuating if necessary. I do imagine a lot of evacuation notices will be put in place, and if you do have the means to evacuate as well and get out towards Toowoomba, Dalby, or further north across the Sunshine Coast where there's friends or family up there, it's my honest recommendation to do so. It's just much better to be safer than to be sorry, and especially if you are concerned about the tropical cyclone, it takes you out of the risk zone. It takes you out of the places that are going to be receiving the most significant impacts, so you're only doing yourself a favour and probably doing emergency services a favour as well. It's just one less possibility that they're going to get a call out. They're going to get absolutely flooded with calls from this tropical cyclone. So again, removing yourself from the situation could actually be a really good solution, but you'd have to do that today. By Wednesday night, it'll be far too dangerous to begin evacuating or begin plans for evacuating, as this tropical cyclone will be knocking on the southeastern corner of Queensland's door. That's all that I have time for today on Tropical Cyclone Alfred. If I have left any questions unanswered, or if you've got any questions, comments, or feedback, then please do let me know in the comment section down below, or feel free to hit me up on Facebook Messenger or over on emails as well. I'd be more than happy to take a look at your question or concern over there. This is a really serious situation for the southeastern corner of Queensland. I urge everybody to remain cool, calm, and collected over the next couple of days. There is certainly a significant risk to lives and property across the southeastern corners of Queensland, and certainly a very concerning time, that's for sure. The first tropical cyclone for a lot of people. So I urge everybody to stay safe and stay calm in an event like this. Make sure you are fully prepared, over-prepared. In fact, it's much better to be over-prepared than to be under-prepared for a situation like this. And make sure you've got a slab of beer on standby as well, or whatever your favourite drink is. It's going to be a rough ride, and you might need a little bit of beer to soften the blows and to really enjoy this tropical cyclone event. Most importantly, it is a tropical cyclone, so again, stay really safe in this event and make sure you don't go overboard. And if you're in the care of other people as well, just make sure you are looking out for them, looking out for the elderly, and looking out for the vulnerable. Queenslanders are very good at banding together and coming out to help people after emergencies. We saw it with the thunderstorm outbreak at the end of 2023. They're really, really good at that kind of stuff. So Tropical Cyclone Alfred, even if it absolutely wallops them, they will recover and they will build on what they lost. But anyway, so that is all from me today. A special shout out to the channel sponsors. Their names are on screen right now, and I could not run this show without them, and I'll catch you all in the next storm. Goodbye.